Okay, I think we can start. Welcome back to our last session. Today now we have Abraham Glasser. We are very happy to have him because he came from US. He's an assistant professor at Gallaudet University. Now I will hand it over to Abraham.
Great, thank you. You can just warn me, please, if I'm running out of time. Just give me a heads up and I'll speed along. Sometimes I'm early, sometimes I'm late, I don't know. So just give me a heads up when time is up. I'm Dr. Abraham Glasser. This is my sign name. And as was mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. You said I came from America, but actually, technically, I just arrived from Brazil 2 days ago. But yes, I work in America. The title today was something I was thinking about in all the different topics and all the different work that I'm involved in. So I've picked this topic, and this is about sign language AI, and I've titled it Towards Authentic Accessibility Through Community Collaboration. I'm going to start with the most important message. And that is, if there continues to be a lack of deaf involvement in sign language AI research, then there will be insurmountable risks and harms to deaf communities. Technological solutions, we need to move away from focusing on that and focus more on inclusivity. And we have seen a lot of different sign language research projects, and there are many, but there is a lack in meaningful deaf involvement. I'll provide some of the reasoning behind this. First of all, there is a lack of understanding of deaf culture and deaf people's lived experiences. I remember with the opening talk from Richard, he was saying, how many of you are hearing? And how many of you know sign? And how many of you are involved in the deaf community? You know, as we see those things, those questions being asked, the number of hands would steadily go down. And if you're working in technology and research, but you don't have actual experience of the end user, of the user of that technology, there is a misalignment there. And there will be inherent bias in your process and in your understanding of the results that you get. And if this continues and perpetuates, it's going to just propagate the marginalization of the deaf and hard of hearing communities. The second theme that I wanted to address is that there's a lack of effective participation of the deaf community. And I want to emphasize the word effective there. Many projects, they progress along, problems arise, and they say, oh, I need to find a deaf person to get involved. And then they test their technology on the deaf person, and then they say goodbye to them, and that's the end of the involvement. The involvement should be meaningful, it should be sustained, and it should be with decision-making abilities for that person. If you have an idea, before the project, if there's an idea of a project that you have, get deaf people involved before you even progress on starting that project. So I saw today a few bit of conflicting messages. People were saying, oh, I have a problem with the data that we have right now. They're all from interpreted interactions. They're from TV. They're not natural. These are things that we're seeing. And some people said, oh yeah, well, we collected a lot more data from, but it was kind of, you know, sometimes bad data, but we have a really big data set and we can share it with the community. So we're having a conflict there. But it also creates a perpetuating cycle. When we're looking at the data that we have in general, there are some serious ethical and fairness. So when we talk about it, we have the FATE situation, F-A-T-E. I know that there's a lot of papers published on this already, but it stands for fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. So we need to start considering this in the data sets that we're using. I'm not going to go into depth about this picture, but I'd like you to just have a look at this. This is how we look at FATE in the data collection process. And it has a lot of moving parts in it. And there's a connection between the signing community and the researcher. And it's never simple. The data collector who goes out and collects that data, how are they interacting with the participants and of the data that they're collecting? Do they have consent forms in place? Is it a one-time consent form, meaning that they've consented for you to use their data, but in 5 years, they say, oh no, I did that study 5 years ago. I want to be removed from that data set. Are you able to do that? So you have a data set collected, and then who is responsible for that data? Who provides access to that data? And what does access to that data look like? There's enormous amounts of considerations with these data sets, and we need to go back to the FATE, the FATE system, when we're evaluating them. Again, looking at the data sets, we need to be considering the data set and modeling biases. It's not just how the data is collected in the first place. Putting that to one side, we need to consider how people are continuing to use the data that is collected. And if the data collected had a bias inherent in it when it was collected, the people who were using that model will inherently have that bias perpetuated. There's other types of bias, for example. You have the model that focuses on gesture or pose. Many of you have spoken about those today when you're looking at gestures and pose. If it's pose-based and gesture-based models, those are not sign language-based. And when you would try to apply them in any way to a sign language project or technology, you will have problems immediately and ongoing. So when you share your results of your model, but you're not really sharing about evaluating the types of flaws, when you're not sharing about evaluating the types of flaws in them, but you're presenting the model as not having these flaws and biases, those flaws and biases will be perpetuated. There was a researcher who used a model from BSL. There was a researcher that used it and then applied that model to an ASL data set. But they did not evaluate how some similarities and differences between the two languages of BSL and ASL would have an impact on the model. There's lots of different linguistic considerations that need to be brought into consideration when these things are being done. The point I'm trying to make is that if there's a bias in the beginning of the data collection process, that bias will continue and will carry on all the way through any type of research project or any technology that's developed. I'm going to pivot a little bit. And this is a presentation of recent work that I've been doing, focusing on ASL in the United States. But I have noticed that there are some issues that have come up with machine learning, the machine learning community and the signing community, and that collaborations haven't always been very effective. So we were trying to look at that relationship. And so we included machine learning experts and ASL experts, trying to understand how collaboration could be improved upon. So the title is Exploring Collaboration to Center the Deaf Community in Sign Language AI. It was published about 2 months for the ACM Assets Conference. This was the motivation, this quote about nothing about us without us. And I'm sure many of you have seen this before. I see a lot of heads nodding. You're familiar. And again, this was a call for interdisciplinary participatory action in AI for sign language researchers. We wanted the sign language communities and the AI researchers to be working in collaboration. The main goal of the study was to support those teams that were working on sign language AI. So we did it in 2 different phases. There's 2 different studies. The first one, we really wanted to understand potential collaboration barriers that people were facing. And we wanted to understand these barriers that they were facing before they started a collaboration. The second study focused on how they could better understand each other and what the motivations that each group had when they arrived at the collaboration. So with the first study, we had a pair of surveys that we undertook. We sent those out to deaf and hard of hearing ASL signers. And then we sent the other surveys to the machine learning practitioners. Some of the machine learning practitioners did work with sign language, but others did not. The survey contained some of the same questions for both groups, but also some that differed. For the ASL signers, we wanted to understand what their motivation was for collaborating with machine learning practitioners and working on AI. We wanted to understand what the ASL signers' motivation could possibly be. And these are some of the results we got. The top 5 you can see here. The ASL signers said that they could envision and really wanted to collaborate so that they could have a high societal impact. The second one is that they saw the machine learning practitioners and they wanted to know if they knew sign language, and if they didn't know sign, maybe the signers didn't want to collaborate with them. So if they had stated that if they did know sign in ASL, that they would be more interested and motivated to collaborate with them. Also, one of the motivations was if there was a large project happening that also included deaf advocates within it. The fourth motivation related to how knowledgeable the machine language practitioners were about deaf culture. And finally, the signers wanted to know, will there be monetary compensation for engaging in a collaboration? Now, we took it from another perspective. In the second group, we had the machine learning practitioners. Again, a very similar first thing that we looked on. What was your first motivation for wanting to be in this collaboration? And the ML practitioners said that we want to make an impact. We wanted to do something of usefulness. And we did notice, though, that the ML practitioners were also more interested in what was available for the research. So they were interested in the availability of data sets. Obviously, they're coming from a technical background, this group, and so they were envisioning, do you have the data set available to do this work? And if so, that was a big motivator. In addition, they were saying, okay, if you've got the data set, do you have the metrics? Do you have the benchmarks? So before we embark on the collaboration, are those available? If yes, a much more highly motivating factor. The other motivations were about different techniques that were available in machine learning. So if it's a big project or a small, very focused project, and they wanted to know if the model was available online. So there are far more technical questions that the ML practitioners were motivated by. Now, comparing the signers and the ML practitioners' expectations, we found they fell into 5 categories. And we noticed that 2 of these categories were largely very different. The first one, looking at AI, was how they would choose a topic, how the topic would be selected. The second one was about timelines and how the project would progress over a timescale. The other 3 here, we got very similar responses from both groups. The responses about goals in sign language modeling were quite similar, and about important metadata, as well as the ASL parameters. But these first two, A and B on the screen, were very different between the two groups. So I'll start with the first one about project topic selection. The orange color you see on the screen here, these are the ASL signers that were involved in the survey. And the green are the machine learning practitioners. More than 80% of the ASL signers thought that sign-to-spoken real-time translation was a topic of interest here. You can see that, so here there's the number 60%. They thought that sign-to-spoken offline translation was of the most interest. Then we go here, it was about 50% thought that spoken to signed real-time translation was really of the top topic of interest. But the machine learning practitioners had a bit of a wider spread. Their topics of interest included translation between two different sign languages, and it didn't even include a spoken language as one of their topics of interest. It included single sign recognition here, as well as continuous sign recognition, and the largest one being sign language understanding here at the bottom. But you can see the difference in the topics of interest that the two groups had. Yes, there was an overlap, but there is also quite a large diversion. Moving on to the expectation differences for timelines. Again, the ASL signers are orange and the machine learning practitioners are green. So you can see with the orange group, they said, oh yes, computers can already recognize individual signs. That was about 30% of that group. And another 30% thought that, oh, within 2 years, computers will be able to recognize individual signs. But the machine learning practitioners did not say that. They said it's going to be 3 to 5 years before we have individual sign recognition. Some said 6 to 10 years. So very different expectations on the timelines. Now, again, I just want to emphasize this, what you're looking at here is looking at single sign recognition, like, hello, for the sign my, name. We're not talking about other things. This is single sign recognition. The ASL signers were saying, oh no, that's basically ready. But the machine learning practitioners were a lot more dubious about it and thought it would be much further in the future. Moving on to this second study, obviously we were looking, the first one was looking at how these groups were thinking before a collaboration happened. And now in study 2, we're looking at how they can improve upon a collaboration as it's ongoing. So we're talking about a paired co-design. So we had ASL experts with machine learning experts that had experience with sign language projects. We had 8 in each group. We did something called a starbursting activity. This was so that both groups could be thinking about questions, not to be coming up with answers, but we asked both groups to come up with a question that they would ask the other group about the collaboration. So the question here in the middle says, what is important to discuss with your collaborator? And they both had to think of questions about who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. So not yes or no's. They had to come up with more of these open-ended questions and then place them on the starburst. So I ran this study. They were paired up, and we had ASL interpreters available. And the deaf researchers would be paired with a hearing machine learning practitioner. And the ASL interpreters would be there, and then I was there as well to help facilitate the activity. So we had both groups think of their questions, and we noticed that some of their questions for each other were quite similar, as well as others that were quite different. We identified 3 themes from the questions that we noted had some similarities. The first was related to timelines, the second being objectives, and then methodology. I'll give you some examples of what was brought up. So in relation to timeline, both groups wanted to make sure that they had really clear, manageable expectations and milestones to be able to work on timelines and outcomes. This came up with both groups. I picked a few quotes. This was from one of the ASL signers. They said, "What do we want to accomplish in the next 4 weeks?" And a machine learning practitioner said, "When do we need an MVP by?" Again, we also had some questions that they came up with a diverging emphasis. There were some quite broad questions about problem solving. And an ASL signer asked, how many ways can we think of to solve this problem? But then others really focused on some specifics, including key priorities and deliverables. So this came from a machine learning practitioner, and they said, what is the most important thing that we need to get right? So we obviously have a collaboration challenge. If we have really big expectations, but we don't have iterative ways to arrive there, we need smaller and more feasible goals to get us even to the middle of the goals. So I showed you 3 themes of questions that had some similarities as well as some divergences. We did have some other themes that were only divergent. We got quite opposite questions from both groups. The first one related to stakeholder analysis. We additionally had some things related to scope and outputs, and finally to validation. Some attendees really prioritize inclusivity and long-term impacts. Again, this comes from an ASL signer who said, where do deaf people see AI going in the future? Convergently, we had people that were very focused on the practicalities and internal operations and issues like this. So, the question being, who are our institutional contacts? Who can we contact? Who are our industry partners? These type of questions. So again, the challenge that we identified here was looking at the fact that a problem-solving focus really could kind of exclude the context of the deaf people's lived experiences and the community's kind of experiences and perspectives that might really impede upon the collaboration. That's a summary. You can read a lot more in our published paper. You can find it online, I believe. It's in the conference proceedings from Assets, and you can find all the details there. I want to discuss a few limitations of the work and things that we didn't look at. I'm going to refer to this as the arc. It's not fully explored. We discussed things about the thought process before a collaboration embarked, and as well as what was happening as a collaboration began. Now, we haven't talked about what happens before the idea is even developed and what team is brought in. We also haven't looked at what happens at a later stage. What happens when results are out? What happens with dissemination? What happens next? We haven't looked at these points of the arc yet. We also noticed that we do have ASL experts, but not many that have themselves direct AI experience. And I think this is generally because of both of our limitations in the way that we recruited for the study and who was available at the time to join and who used ASL. Yes, there are limitations inherent there, but it also does reflect a systemic bias. There are systemic barriers and less resources for deaf people being involved in AI. That's something to delve into another day. Looking at our study, we had interpreters available, we had deaf researchers, hearing researchers, we had machine learning practitioners and ASL experts there for a very structured discussion. But did this really reflect the broader real-world landscape? It doesn't necessarily reflect every deaf lived experience, or how we made sure that all voices were given the same equal terms in the meeting, that everyone had a chance to contribute. But is that how it works in the real world? Is that the same level of access that people are getting? Was it equitable? We also realized that we need a wider range of stakeholders. We have experts, which means we had ASL experts, people who use ASL, they were community members, but it didn't include ASL linguists, for example, or different types of people with different levels of linguistic knowledge, or a wide range of demographics that we weren't able to capture in our study. Again, going to change my tact again into something else. I noticed before I came, when I looked at the program, and also based on another event experience that I've had, I noticed that many people frame their work as helping communication, supporting interpreting, connecting hearing and deaf communities and people. And it's kind of envisioning AI and the future of it as something for interpreting. I'll put up a list of different ethical and technical considerations, and maybe you don't really have an AI for interpreting yet, but as we experience with spoken language interpreting, we have Google Translate, for example. You can imagine the use of Google Translate as your interpreter in another country or in another place. Just keep that in mind as we put these ones up here. There's a lot of things up here, and some are related to data, some are related to privacy, who owns the data, who controls the data. We then also move on to things about bias in the data sets, bias in the models. We need to have risk considerations. Would you be willing to use Google Translate in a medical appointment for yourself? When you received your diagnosis, would you be comfortable having that on a Google Translate system? And when we're looking at language pairs, that's much more limiting than other things. For example, when you have a resource-rich language, it often performs better. So when we're talking about spoken English, moving to spoken Spanish, there's quite a lot of details and translations. I mean, yes, they're not perfect, but it's better than other kind of minority languages when you have a resource-rich language that you're moving between. How does AI itself deal with transparency and explainability? And finally, when we're looking at human oversights and accountability of AI, we need to take this into consideration as well. These things are more of big picture in the future, but I think we need to have these on our mind now as we embark on research. When we're looking at AI avatars, when we're using those as an interpreter in a hospital in the future, just imagine this, an avatar comes up, say they misinterpret information and they provide the wrong diagnosis, and then the patient were to die. Who takes accountability for that? Is that the hospital? Is it the doctor? Is it the AI company? Where does that responsibility fall? All of these concerns are obviously applicable to not only sign languages, but spoken languages as well. The spoken language industry has a group called Safe AI. That is a group of spoken language interpreters and practitioners, and they have an international standard organization in place. They make sure that interpreters are applying all of these considerations and that these considerations are applied to technologies. So we thought about why we don't see sign language represented there. So we now have a group, mostly volunteers, and the group is called COSET, which is the Coalition for Sign Language Equity and Technology. We represent many different sign languages and countries, and we are represented with professors, researchers, professionals, interpreters. There's a lot of people and a lot of variety in the group. And our goal is to develop industry standards that promote shared understanding and outcomes for what we call principal communicators. So we use the word principal communicators rather than end users. And we think the word end users is more, it gives the implication of an afterthought. This is a famous model. It's called the Gartner Hype Cycle. And it's what we look at with new technologies. When a new technology is released, everyone is thrilled. It gains a lot of popularity. People use it in a lot of different ways. Errors crop up, and then you see a massive decrease in its use and popularity because of that. Then people go to work and fix the problems that came up. It gets a little bit better, and then it plateaus and becomes part of the ecosystem. We've noticed that this is happening with sign language AI. And I think maybe it could be around here, maybe. We're not here, that's for sure. We're trying to jump now and just to think about all of the different ethical considerations, risks involved, accountability, and we're trying to set up a system for this and some standards for that. So that's where we're working. And it means that later, as the technology matures and is ready, we have the system in place already to apply onto it. So we are ready before the technology is out there and in the wild. Just going to discuss two different important things that we have recently put out there with Safe AI. We published something called the Safe AI Guidance. Safe AI already had started a process of this. We got involved and we said sign language isn't involved. Let's collaborate with them and get sign language put into that standard. And these are criteria for safe, fair, and ethical development when you are implementing automatic interpreting products using artificial intelligence. This one, the second one, is a bit more recent. Now, the industry has AI toolkits for spoken language already. But what they don't have is evaluation toolkits that are independent. Many AI companies develop them themselves. They develop their own metrics. They develop their own internal ratings for their own software. And what we really need is an outside neutral party that can go in and measure and evaluate what they're providing. So we published this. It's called the AI Interpreting Solutions Evaluation Toolkit. We're working on part A, that's out, and that focuses on organization, implementation, and management in various contexts. There will be more parts coming. B and C on the way soon, but they're currently in progress. Part A, though, is out and ready. Feel free to type it in to the internet and find it yourself. Have a look. How are you doing? Good. I just want to wrap up with a few calls to action from the room. Starting with Richard's presentation today, he said, we need more deaf involvement. Nothing about us without us, again. And there are many different ways for deaf people to be involved and to be, but at the moment we're seeing a lot of tokenism, and we see deaf people who, we want deaf people to be the ones leading the projects and making decisions as well. As we have seen a bit of this discussed today, but we do need to focus on real-world applications. As sign language technology develops, we need to keep in mind, what is it for? What is the end product going to be? How will this apply in the real world? Can we be really transparent about that? And we need to build data sets, build interfaces, build algorithms for real-world use cases. But those real-world use cases need to take in consideration the different limitations and things that and the real-world constraints that we have. Again, we need to think about sharing and reproducibility. We have seen this brought up today, but there's a lot of people who are working in silos. And some of you are using different labeling systems, different annotation systems, different sign languages, and these are all happening in silos. And in that case, it is quite hard to build collaboration. I know that. We do need to look at how we can share better, how we can collaborate better. And I know it's tough because there is competition. You know, I want to be the first. I want to get there first. I want to produce it first. I want to produce it better. But again, collaboration is so huge in this. I think, Matt, thank you so much for your presentation. But if you remember his last comment about the data problem, people are saying he wants an automatic tool for annotation because then you get better data, right? This cycle, this chicken and an egg thing is something that we do need to address. And if we can create tools that make better data, the data will be better for what we're looking at and how we're producing AI. Finally, I want to discuss a little bit about positionality. It's complex, I admit that, but the deaf community has a history of oppression and marginalization. So oftentimes when we see a collaboration happening, our first question is, do you know sign? Do you know anything about deaf culture? Have you been around deaf people before? And we really do need to share our backgrounds with each other when we're embarking on collaborations. We need to talk about privilege. We need to talk about these things in our work. And we need to express our biases. It's myself as well. I'm starting to just document, you know, I will write with my paper. And when I'm writing papers, I'll write things like, I am a deaf professor. I have had 10 years of experience. I have worked in human-computer interactions. You know, I'll keep all of these things very clear about the background of who I am when I write a paper. And I think we need to have that in a lot more of our research. I think that concludes what I wanted to say. Thank you so much for watching, and any questions I would welcome. Thanks. You can do the questions.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. Today, maybe we can have one, or if it is quick, maybe two questions.
Abraham, could you go back to the previous slide? So the problem, I mean, I 100% agree, but the problem we've got is that when it comes to deaf leadership, right, so the deaf community, it's quite a small community. So when you're talking about deaf leadership, there's a finite number of people that tend to, you know, get poached. Oh, we should contact person. And then, but even, you know, if we go out to do user trials, it's a finite community that get bored with, oh, you already asked me to do this last week. So how do we manage the fact that actually it's a that deaf community is a finite resource that gets fed up very quickly?
Oh, that is an excellent question. And I get that question a lot, actually. It goes back to the systemic barriers and not having a lot of resources available for deaf and hard of hearing people who want to learn AI skills. It's improving now. And I feel like perhaps in the next 5 years, we'll have double or perhaps triple the number of deaf people who have that experience. And of course, in the future, we will have more and more deaf people who are available to be involved in AI projects and in higher management positions within those projects. In the immediate future, though, I feel like we really need to collaborate better and that we have to transition opportunities as opposed to just having somebody ask for deaf person's feedback, and once they have that feedback, then dismissing the deaf person and continuing on with their research without the deaf person. So maybe having somebody come on board as a research assistant for a year or 2 years, and then they can learn the project inside and out, and then are able to become a recruiter for that project. And so they are able to grow within that community and grow within the project. And there are different approaches, but it's a problem of, like you said, finite resources. And of course, even if we're considering other countries outside of, say, the UK and the US, it's an even more limited number of resources that you are working with. Within America, previously there were not a lot of educators for deaf people who were able to support deaf people within that process of growth. We are seeing that get better within America, the UK, Europe, but we're not there yet. We still need to grow that pipeline, and that does take a bit of time.
Okay, I'm afraid we don't have enough time for another question because we have 5 more presentations there. Thanks again, Abraham Glasser.